Hello there. Hello, good evening. Hello from Memmingen in Germany. Hello, Robert. How are you today?
Hi, Martin. How are you? Well,
I'm,
thanks.
I'm good. Great to have you here.
My pleasure to be here.
We're at 70 something people right now here in joining us tonight. Or I think it's lunchtime on the East Coast, and it's almost dinner time here in Germany and the UK. Glad you're here. Just post your questions in the chat box and let us know where you're tuning in from. Glad you're here. We have a very, very special guest here today, one of Northern Ireland's foremost capacities in the field of natural history, Robert Thompson. Robert is a professional natural history photographer, a specialist in close-up and macro photography in the UK. He has been widely published in the UK, Ireland, and internationally. He appeared on TV and radio and is here today for the first time as a webinar host. So today is a first for him. Yeah. Robert, are you nervous?
Not too bad, no.
No. Okay, awesome. Well, Robert, as you notice, he's a great guy who came in contact with us pretty late, and since then has given us insight into his work, as well as providing tips and tricks. I think, Robert, we know each other since early 2020. Is that right?
Yeah, right at the
when you first reached out to us, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yes.
So pretty much the beginning of the current pandemic.
Yeah.
Before we met, Robert, you own several different tripods, and which you have since replaced with our Triopod modular tripods. And I think you're swapping legs and spiders back and forth.
Absolutely.
At least that's what you are telling me.
Yeah, I'll speak a little bit about this later on in my conversion to NovaFlex.
Okay, so people, if you want to dive deeper into Robert's work, right after this presentation, just visit his website at robertthompsonphotography.com. It is filled with amazing images, reviews, and behind-the-spot profiles that Robert created, which are very interesting to read. And another interesting topic about Robert, like myself, he's also a fan of historic K-dramas on Netflix. And among many other topics, we regularly speak about the latest shows as well. And today, Robert, we are looking forward to learn from you and to gain a deeper insight into your work and your photographic approach. So I would say, without further ado, the stage is yours.
Okay, Martin, thanks. First of all, I would like to say vielen Dank an NovaFlex für die Einladung, and my thanks to everyone who's going to join the webinar, and my thanks for Matt, who is in the background, who is looking after everything on the technical side. I suppose, in a way, where I would like to start is at the beginning. For me, I've always been interested in natural history from a child. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a large parkland estate, and it had a 105-acre lake. So I was surrounded in wildlife, from birds to insects, all manner of creatures. So from 9 or 10 years old, I developed that interest. And that interest has stayed with me. I went to London, continued my studies over there, and when I finished, I came back, and I was lucky at that particular time to get involved with a university in Belfast on a project looking at mayflies. It was a group of insects that very little was known about in Northern Ireland, and that's really where I had my first experience of photography. I realized that there were so few pictures of these insects that I decided that I would give it some time and build a collection myself. This is one of the very first pictures I ever took, and it's 30 years old. And if I told you that I took it with a Pentax LX. I had a standard lens, which I reversed. I cut a hole out of the body cap. I got myself a piece of black drain pipe, and I taped the lens in reverse to the front and the body cap to the back. And I used stop-down metering and a flash gun, and this was the result. And that picture was taken 30 years ago. And that really was the turning point for me. I became focused on photography in a lot of the natural history work that I did. I always had an interest in dragonflies. So as a child living in the Parkland estate, there were hundreds during the late spring and summer, and I was always intrigued with them. And I maintained that interest really right from childhood, right through my adult life. Here we're looking at the hairy hawker. Its Latin name is Brachyton pratensi. Dragonflies for me are a fascinating group of insects to photograph. They're challenging. They're not easy insects to get close to. They've got 360-degree vision. They can fly forwards, backwards, and particularly the larger insects are much more difficult to get in close. So for the majority of my photography, I tend to shoot dragonflies with longer lenses and extension tubes. This shot was taken with a Nikon 300 2.8 with extension tubes. It gives you a good working distance. And I find also when you get opportunities to photograph these insects, it keeps the background clutter-free and you get this nice diffused appearance. I'm particularly careful about dragonflies in the way that I photograph them. I look for subjects that are quite often isolated, and the background is in a distance behind them. That's the type of images that I prefer to shoot. So quite often it's a question of I will photograph early in the morning and also in the evening time. I'd rarely chase these insects during the middle of the day. But I was lucky enough about 20 years ago, the government in the Republic of Ireland approached me about doing a high-profile project. And that was right up my street. I mean, here was a group of insects that I had a passion for. And it was linked to a recording program. And it was the first ever of its kind in Ireland. And it led to a huge publication at the end of the study. And I owe a lot of my photographic career basically to that first project on dragonflies. I also, in these sort of days, like to try where possible and shoot wide-angle macro. It's become a very popular subject in the last sort of several years. Laowa brought out a lens, a 15mm wide-angle macro, which is a great lens, and it allows you the opportunity to get in very, very close, but you're also including the habitat, which now becomes equally important. When you're using a long lens, you're diffusing the background. When you're shooting wide-angle macro, you have to pay attention to the background. The key is obviously to find the subjects. And then, of course, you've got to find them in a situation where the background is actually complementing them and not a distraction. So this is why I find this kind of photography a lot more challenging. And being a natural history photographer with a natural history background, it's the natural images that actually interest me. I'm not interested in the manipulation of nature. I like to photograph it as it is. Another part of my work, which is important to me, is obviously GPS. So every image I shoot has GPS, and you'll see later on in the webinar, why that is. So basically, the first part of the webinar is about me as a photographer and the type of subjects that I photograph, in between doing a lot of my other routine natural history photography. The second part of the webinar is me actually explaining about some of the Novaflex equipment that I currently use in my workflow. Butterflies is a big passion of mine as well. And again, leading on from the Dragonfly project, we then were able to approach the governments again, and both in the Republic and Northern Ireland, and look at recording and photographic projects based around butterflies and moths. So again, for me, butterflies, I've traveled over Europe. I've photographed many species in many different countries. I find at the end of the day that when I started into natural history photography, there wasn't the same availability of many of these particular insects. So for me, that worked extremely well. And I moved on very, very quickly from 35mm to medium format. And that became my camera system, both the 645 Mamiya and the RZ6x7. Those were the two systems I used for a good part of my early photographic career. And then when digital got a hold and I felt that it was good enough, I switched to Nikon. And I have remained with Nikon for over 20 years. Their equipment is superb. I have never had any inclination to move to another system. Let's be honest, like these days, cameras are so good from all of the companies. There are no bad cameras. But I think as photographers, the problem that we have today is we expect camera companies to produce cameras that are virtually flawless, that will do every single thing for us, from high speed and very fast autofocus. But actually, how did we manage all those years ago with relatively modest autofocus? And you know, there were amazing images that were taken then. This is a picture from one of my workshops in Europe, this European swallowtail. So again, I'm using a long lens here and keeping the background nicely diffused. I took a big interest not only in butterflies, but in moths. Moths are the poor relations, really, of butterflies. They don't get the same attention. Yet, scientifically, there's no difference between them. There are a lot more moths. Certainly, if you look in the British Isles, there are a lot more moths that fly in the daytime than there actually are species of butterfly in the British Isles. There's over 180,000 species of moths that have been identified and documented. I call them nature's nocturnal butterflies. And I've devoted a lot of my photographic career in between other photographic work in documenting and photographing these amazing insects from all over Europe and different parts of the world. This is the silver-striped hawk moth, which is a lot more common in Europe and quite rare in the British Isles. But again, you'll notice that this is actually shot with a 200mm macro, which Nikon brought out in 1994. And much to my disappointment, they have never actually replaced it. The 105 is at 3 or 4 different updates. And recently, the new Z105 is a superb lens. But unfortunately, they've neglected this, which I consider to be an extremely important macro lens. And many macro photographers actually still use this lens today. And moths, of course, are extremely diverse. They come in all shapes and sizes. I think that's what I find so fascinating. And when you look at their natural history, a lot of them have devised over evolution, all sort of shapes, sizes, colors, and patterns. And here you can see the scarce Merveille du jour, which is quite a rare moth. How it blends naturally with the lichens on tree trunks. And that's where it's happy. Its pattern reflects that evolutionary trail. And to be honest, I find them much more fascinating and interesting than butterflies. I also, over 20 years ago, developed an interest in Saturnaid moths. Now, they are really they're absolutely fantastic insects. Some of them have wingspans of up to 16 centimeters. I've been lucky enough to work with different professional entomologists and universities from Europe on these moths, and I've accumulated over a 20-year period many species Some of them I photographed in situ in the wild, and others have come from South America and places like that. Some of them have rarely been photographed, and scientifically I have been documenting these for a long period of time, with a view that we will publish a comprehensive book, hopefully maybe in the not too distant future. They're extremely nervous moths, so again you have to be very, very careful, and particularly those, like this is the African moon moth. It's an amazing species, but a nervous moth. You can see it's got very long tails, and these can easily be damaged. But I find them absolutely fascinating. And in my spare time, and when I have free time, I devote a lot of my photographic time to particularly butterflies and moths. I also have to cover plants routinely as well, on contracts sometimes, and when I travel throughout Europe and different places, I run photographic workshops, and I'm always accumulating many different types of images. I have a big interest in orchids. I've collaborated both north and south of the border, and I've co-authored a book as well on orchids as I've done on butterflies and moths and dragonflies too. I suppose, again, I apply the same sort of principle. I don't often photograph plants in close-up with short focal length macros, even the 105. I am a person who likes the pictorial aspect to an image. And just because a plant is static, you get a lot of people who think there isn't a challenge in plant photography. Actually, you couldn't be further from the truth. It requires a lot more skill, looking and deciding which plant is in the best position, what the background is like behind it. And one of my favorite techniques is, again, long lenses, anywhere between a 3 and a 500mm extension tubes. And I like to shoot low down so that I can allow the foreground foliage to blur. So I'm always looking for those creative opportunities. And these are just typical examples of the type of imagery of flowers that I personally like to photograph. Previous image was a pyramidal orchid, and this is a wood anemone. Again, shot with a very long lens, and I've just allowed the foreground there to blur. These are the most pictorial type of images for me. I do a lot of aquatic photography. A lot of photographers in the macro world tend to avoid this. It is very time consuming. It requires a lot of planning in advance. And a number of years ago, in one of my earlier books, I illustrated a setup that I developed. It's all worked from a single clamp, and you've got a T connection at the top, which allows me to put flexible goosenecks, and then I can attach flash guns as well as one in the center. So I can set this up very, very quickly beside a river or a rock pool, and I have an assortment of different tanks depending on what I'm doing. But the beauty and the advantage of this type of work is I can use the water from the river. I can filter it. It's at the same temperature. The subject is going to be not stressed in the same way that it would be if you tried to do it in the studio. I can use the natural substrate from the river to create the background. And most importantly, at the end, when I've done all that, I can release the subject back into its environment. And this is the way that I shoot virtually all of my aquatic photographs. Typically, dragonflies is something that I've covered quite a lot. I've photographed every single British species of dragonfly in their larval form. And this is a common hawker, and it's done exactly in the same technique as I've just described previously. It also allows me to work with more sensitive creatures in the same way. Crayfish in Ireland as a whole are rare and they're protected. So being able to work at a stream where they actually occur, create the the substrate, build the habitat, and then introduce your subject. It's a much quicker process, I find, and I just simply put the creature back into its own environment. In these situations, I just use flash. It's just simple, quick, and it saves any hassle. I also do a lot of coastal photography at rock pools, and that is one of the most challenging areas, obviously, because you're working against the tide, the general weather conditions, finding the right type of subject. And in this example here, this is why I really like the NovaFlex approach. This is the Pro 75. I can virtually put it at any angle that I choose. You can see where the circle is highlighted. There's a tiny little cleft in the rock there, and there's a pool. There are anemones, the elegant anemones are in there. So I can set this up, and then all I have to do is use the flash, and this is the result. When you're working in sort of rock pools where you're working against the tide, I find that this is by far the best approach. Sometimes working directly into a rock pool where the surface is ripping and due to wind can be problematic. I get around that simply by utilizing the same technique as I did at the river. I am able to use the appropriate tank very, very close to the shoreline, or if I can get my Jeep as close as possible, I can place the tank in my Jeep, create the set from the natural materials that are there, introduce the subject, and then return it back. And particularly with marine creatures, this is really important. They're highly sensitive to changes, not only in water temperature, but when they're out of their natural environment. So I find that this works quickly. The creatures look naturally. This is a common prawn, and again, it's just photographed using straight flash. Long spine sea scorpion, again utilizing the same technique. And of course, marine mollusks or nudibranchs, as they're called, are beautiful creatures. You get some of the species occur in rock pools. Their land equivalents are snails and slugs. I suppose people don't find them as attractive, but certainly their marine cousins come in many different shapes, sizes, and colors. They're very, very attractive creatures to photograph. And again, it's done exactly the same way. I call this pushing the boundaries quite simply because I think every photographer, no matter what their routine photography is, are always thinking about ideas and projects and something a wee bit different. And it's the same for me as well. Two photographers that greatly influenced, I suppose, my photography in the early days was Stephen Dalton, who was based in the UK but had a worldwide reputation. He was a pioneer of high-speed flash photography. His photographs really in the 70s and 80s and even before that were truly amazing, and I was always inspired just by the amount of time, effort, and attention to detail that Stephen put into his images. I was lucky enough to eventually be accepted into his agency, and I think at that time I was one of the youngest photographers, and I got to know him. He very kindly wrote the foreword in one of my first photography books, which I was extremely honored that he did. And I suppose in a way, a lot of my style has been, over the years, developed as a result of the inspirational work that he did, and also an American photographer called John Shaw. They were the only two authors I ever ordered books in advance, because I knew every single publication that these photographers would actually produce would be outstanding. And bear in mind, they were all working with film, which at times could be a lot more challenging than digital today. So John Shaw was a remarkable photographer. I think he was based in Colorado in America. And his books were certainly, really inspirational as well. And both those photographers had a big impact on the type of work that I did. So I was asked, could I produce photographs of a frog diving into water? I thought it was possible, but I couldn't do it conventionally. So with all these projects, it's a question of working everything out in advance and how you can create the situation to make it actually happen. So obviously, this had to be done in the studio. A tank, I used an infrared beam which was connected to the camera, a large rock that sat above the tank, and basically it was a question then of collecting the frogs. I live close to a river, so I collected several frogs. One or two were very accommodating and jumped many times. Some of the others jumped once and just totally refused after that. So that's the kind of thing you were up against. But the problem is when they actually dive off the rock into the water, they could interrupt the beam in any particular area. So some could be partially in focus. One could be completely in focus. Unfortunately, its legs may have sort of be out of the frame. So it's a question of refinement and, making adjustments and basically perseverance. And 2.5 days later, 300 images later, this is the shot that I had in mind. And it's like all projects, it requires time, patience, and constantly looking at ways that you can refine that process and encourage the creature then to go exactly where you want it to go. Utilizing the same concept, I was sitting in my patio one summer afternoon, and I was just watching all the different wasps that were sort of accumulating around the fuchsia. And I came up with the idea it would be quite nice to do a flight shot. The problem is, how do you sort of confine the wasps to just going to one flower? So again, it's the planning and the process. And for me, what I simply did was tie some of the other branches back, bag the flowers, set up the infrared beam, camera, everything in position. And I worked on this on and off for a couple of days. But the secret ingredient that actually made the difference was I used a sugar solution and lightly spread it onto the flower. And that really did attract the wasps. So it was a question of it interrupting the beam exactly in the correct position. And because it's macro and it's close up, a millimeter is a mile out in this case. So you've got to be prepared for quite a lot of failures. But eventually, I did get several shots. This was just one that were, in my opinion, very acceptable. And then I got a project like this where I was asked by a conservation organization in Northern Ireland who were producing a large-scale poster. And they had baby long-eared owls on their reserve. The problem was they were about 35 feet up in the tree. So photographing them from the ground was out of the question. Building a hide was also out of the question because it wasn't that far from a main road and there were public housing not that far away. So that would have attracted attention and it just simply wasn't feasible. So again, it's the planning and how you might tackle something like this is the key to it. The camera is the last link in the chain. It's the means by which you capture that visualization. It's not the important part at that stage. So there were trees that were pretty close to where the nest was. And I came up with the idea and I got 2 foot long square sticks that were about 3 inches square. And I created a ladder, just like rungs up an adjacent tree trunk. So I would actually be able to climb up the trunk of the tree. I had a safety rope around me and I put 2 planks across branches that were virtually nearly at eye level to the eyelets. All I needed to place on that was a bean bag. So then I could back up with the camera slung around my shoulder and a powerful flash unit, camera, long lens on the beanbag, and that's how the shot was done. And it was done quickly, and I was able then to remove the rungs that I'd created on the tree trunk, and there was no sign of anything then that was left behind. So it comes down basically to, in my opinion, thinking about projects, thinking about how best to approach them. The National Trust own many properties in Northern Ireland. In Fermanagh, they asked me, would it be possible to get a shot of one of their own grebes on the loch shore? They didn't want a shot of just the grebe on the water. They specifically wanted it on the nest, and they wanted it in profile. Not a just a bit of a tall order, but with a little bit of field work, we managed to find out of several nests one that the platform was not too far out and not in too deep a water. So what we did was, over a period of 3 days, we built a reed screen in the same Phragmites reeds and left it for a week. I was going to obviously have to get in a wetsuit, so I already tried an adjacent area, and the water was just up to my waist, so there wasn't really going to be a problem there. So we let it sit for a week. We came back. The problem was Ireland gets a lot of rain at times, so when we got back, the water level had risen, and I'm not that, I'm not 6 feet tall, so the water line now moved from my waist to virtually the top of my chest, and I had to stand for 2.5 hours at a time in the cold water, and the tripod and camera was just about 30 centimeters above the water line. And for 2 days, most of the time, the bird looked directly at me, and it was only just very occasionally it sat in profile. And at the end, that's how the shot was got. Ireland has many different islands around it, and during the late spring and summer, you get a huge influx of seabirds that nest on these islands. I've run workshops for over 20 years photographing seabirds. I never tire of photographing them or just spending time in amazement just looking at them. Gannets obviously are a big catch for many people, and I have photographed them hundreds of times over those years. But again, I'm always looking for those pictures that I think are just that little bit special. And this is one for me that I took some time ago that still remains one of my favorite pictures. It's taken in the late evening, taken with the long lens, obviously. And I just like the overall ambience of the image and the pair together. And we've all done flight shots of gannets. Many photographers, that's one of the first things they want to do. And we all own hundreds. I mean, I have thousands of pictures over the years of them. But again, as a natural history photographer, I'm always looking for something just more than a flight shot and a plain blue sky. And in an incoming tide here, I noticed that some birds occasionally were flying between the rocks and the waves were lashing off the rocks. So the following evening, I came back with a big lens and I spent most of the evening just waiting for the occasional bird to fly between sort of the incoming tide and the waves splashing and the rock. And persistence paid off, and I managed to get several nice images where the bird was just exactly where I wanted it. And again, it's a picture that not only shows the bird in flight, but shows the habitat around it and the conditions at the time. These are the types of pictures that basically interest me. Moving on to projects again, the Dragonfly project, the Butterflies and Moth, the Orchid projects that were national projects within Ireland were a great stepping stone for me, and they proved to be very, very successful. This was the most ambitious one that I had to date, which was the natural history of Ulster. Ulster, some of its counties lie in Northern Ireland in the UK, for those that aren't familiar, and some of the counties are also in the Republic of Ireland, but it is classified as the province of Ulster. So I approached Dublin and Belfast, and they agreed. Nothing like this had ever been done before, where a natural history of a province from its formation and its geological structure of its landscape, how the people over hundreds of years have influenced the landscape, and of course, all the many different aspects of its wildlife. So this was an extremely expensive project, but we got the go-ahead to do it. It took 5 years to do, 600 pages, over 600 photographs. What I wanted to do was, I didn't simply...
it's a heavy one, by the way. I have it here.
It's good for keeping doors open. So I didn't want to do probably what other photographers and myself have done many times, is go to well-known areas and put your tripod in the same spots as you've done previously. I thought about, let's try and show the landscape from the air. In a lot of situations, it's never been done, and allow the public to see, you know, the province of Ulster in a way that's not really been illustrated. So it took a lot of planning, and basically, to cut a long story short, they agreed to it. So we chartered a helicopter company that normally flies television crews all over the UK. It had to be done in a very safe way. And we got PDG helicopters who are professional pilots. If you're not fond of heights, this is not for you. I had a crash course for a day on health and safety and an emergency, what to do. Also, the doors are removed for photography. So when the helicopter banks and things like that, you know, it can be quite nerve-wracking. But nevertheless, I don't have a fear of heights, so it wasn't a problem. Learning to speak and communicate to the pilot, knowing the elevation that you needed in order to get the shot where the helicopter needed to be. You also had to file a flight plan 2 days prior to flying. I also had to book the helicopter 6 weeks in advance and confirm 48 hours prior to flying from Scotland. Every time it took off from Scotland, it was £2,000 to start. The whole project at the end, just for the aerial photography, was over £25,000. But this is actually the full image of the front cover, but it shows the landscape in a way that was just, for me, simply outstanding. And over a period of a year, we flew in all sorts of weather. We covered virtually every island. We flew out over 9-10 miles out into the Atlantic to make sure that we got as much as we could. And it was an amazing experience. I would say the one thing that I did learn from it, which they didn't teach me on the 1 day course, was you must not drink water. You must stop drinking water the day before. And of course, I was on my way down to the airport, drinking out of a bottle of water, not thinking. And of course, once you go up, in 45 minutes, my bladder were absolutely squealing. And between the vibration of the helicopter and the cold, pilots not normally allowed to land outside the flight path or the designated areas. And I had a young pilot, and he was very sympathetic, and he dropped it quickly behind the mountain and gave me 5 minutes. But I learned afterwards not to do that. So it was an amazing experience. And, you know, when you look at northwest Donegal, I mean, Donegal is a large number of sea locks, but to actually be able to photograph them from the air, some of the work was shot with a D3 and other Nikon cameras. The landscape takes on a whole new concept for me. And during that time, I really did enjoy it. And subsequently after that, I did other aerial commissions. Drones are used now, of course. And the problem with drones is there are just simply situations and places that you cannot use them. And a camera from a helicopter is still the best way to do it. This is Trebiga Bay. It's one of the most famous sea locks in Donegal. the tide is out, but you can still see the flow on the water in the deep areas. That's the channel that the water comes in, when the tide comes in. So an amazing, experience during that time. Photographing a lot of the islands was also quite challenging. I'm up about just over 1,000 feet here. It's about 10 miles out into the Atlantic, and this is Inistroll, and it's the most northerly island in Ireland. So really, it's the most northerly point in Ireland in terms of its geography. It's got an interesting history as well, because the island itself, the rock on the island, is amongst the oldest. It's 1.7 billion years old. The lighthouse was manned, I think, right up until the 1980s. It's now automated, and people actually lived on this island, I think, right up until the late 1920s. You can see the old schoolhouse at the back of the lighthouse, and it's uninhabited now, so it's not that easy to reach. But working from a helicopter gives you the opportunity and the positions, that you can get into to be able to shoot high resolution imagery of places like this. So that's just a little bit about some of my photography, my style, and my approach. I think, like many photographers, throughout the years, I bought bits and pieces of equipment. I tried to make them work together. If I couldn't, I designed equipment to make the process easier. Of course, I knew about Novaflex. I admit at the time, not, even in some of my earlier photography publications, not as much. I have to say, I regret that in some aspects, because since I've bought into the concept of using Novaflex equipment, in many ways, it's transformed a lot of my photography and some of the things that I do. This is some of my equipment that I use regularly in my workflow. Magic ball here is one of my favorite ball heads. In my opinion, there is nothing that comes close to it. The versatility that head has is far greater than any ball and socket head that's currently available. I also use the Classic Ball 5.2 and the Classic Ball 3.2. And the beauty about those heads is they've got additional drop slots, so you immediately have more positional ability with both these ball heads. The other really, really important thing as well is you have precise friction control, preset friction control. And that for me is brilliant, because I know when I put different types of lenses or different setups on, I know precisely which number and which friction control that I need. That is something that you can't get in a conventional ball head. It's very, very difficult to emulate exactly the same thing each time. But having this, I think, is brilliant. And there's absolutely no creep. I have found, no matter what setup I use, there are no creep whatsoever. I'll talk a little bit in a moment about those two tripods. The CASTEL-MICRO, I use a lot. The bellows systems, both the BAL Pro 1 and the BAL F as well. And everything about the Novaflex concept just works. It's been cleverly designed, cleverly thought out. And you'll see just from some of the examples, from my point of view as a photographer, I should have been using it sooner, to be perfectly honest. Having owned 7 tripods, most of them individually are okay, but I never managed to get a tripod that would meet all of my needs. And in every single photography book that I've ever written about, I've always included a chapter on tripods because of the importance of a tripod. And I think digitally, these days, a lot of photographers try to work without them. I've even had photographers come on some of my macro photography courses with no tripod. Can you believe it? But they're happy to pump the ISO up and work differently. That's not how I work. So the two tripods that I use frequently in my routine photography is the Pro 7.5 and the Tripod M. I think the Tripod M came out in 2019, and I think it was 2017 when the Pro 7.5 came out. Martin will correct me if I'm wrong.
That is correct.
That is correct.
Precise dates.
Right. You can see on the Pro 7.5 why I like it. You can look at this setup, and it's got everything from NovaFlex from the top to the bottom. And why? Because everything fits perfectly. There is no free play, no movement. It's just superbly engineered. One of the things I should point out is that the Arca Swiss style template is used by many different camera companies. And in fact, I have other ball and socket heads from other companies. And each of them have their own slant on how they interpret that sort of patent, or when it was, or that style. Which means sometimes when you use components from another manufacturer, which is Arca Swiss style, onto a different one, they're not completely compatible. The dovetails and the angulation is not quite right. Therefore, when you put a lot of heavier equipment on it, you can have mobility and instability. You won't find that, and you will not find this with the NovaFlex equipment. Everything is precisely right down to the very L bracket, is precisely milled, angulated, and everything just fits beautifully together. That is one of the things that impresses me so much about both the whole system, from its tripods right through till its bellows. Everything just works together. Before I talk just about one or two other things, I mentioned about how important tripods are. And I just thought it might be worth mentioning some of the key features for maybe some of you out there that are new to photography or new to macro, and how, from my point of view, a tripod is so important. So one of the things it does is gives you compositional accuracy and adjustments. So it means when you frame everything up, it's 100% accurate each time. When you use your eye and you handhold, you're not. Every shot that you take will be marginally different. Focus and sharpness, you can pinpoint focus precisely where you want it each time, and it will replicate that through each successive image. You cannot do that when you handhold. Sharpness goes without saying. If it's on a tripod, it's always going to be sharper. And then those compositional sort of difficulties where you're photographing things in a difficult situation, trying to handhold something and twist your body into a strange position just so that you can see, doesn't really work very well. That's where a tripod, again, has a huge advantage. Complete range of shutter speeds and aperture selection. Of course, you can choose to use anything that you want. You're restricted to maybe perhaps certain apertures, higher ISO, when you're hand holding something. I think if you're seriously interested in macro photography, particularly working at higher magnifications, then it's an absolute must. And of course, you can use the camera's optimum ISO setting because it's supported on a tripod. And importantly as well, lastly, you've got freedom from the viewfinder. So you don't have to constantly keep your eye to the viewfinder, and you can look and assess the composition visually rather than having to keep your eye pinned to the viewfinder all the time. So the NovaFlex system, the versatility of it, I carry all my tripod legs and all the various bits of equipment in the bag in my Jeep. So whatever photographic situation I'm sort of doing, and when I arrive, I can decide what is the best configuration for me, whether I need to use the Pro 7.5, use shorter legs or legs from the Tripod M. The beauty about the system is no matter what type of photography that you're undertaking, everything is interchangeable, and that is the beauty about it. You don't need your 7 tripods and carrying 2 or 3 with you to do different jobs. You can just build the configuration that you need to do the particular job. And for me, that was a game changer. So it certainly eliminates the need for multiple tripods. The tripods, the spider base, which is the main component on each of the tripods, is superbly engineered. It will take any combination of legs, both long, short, combination of both, and we'll talk a wee bit about that later, how I use that. But having the interchangeability is where the innovation comes in. And the one thing I will say about Novaflex, and I'm not paid by them, I use their equipment. They've invited me to speak, and I am being honest and speaking frankly about the equipment, is they think outside the box. There's no other company that I can think of that either manufacture tripods that have actually come up with this concept where you can mix and match. And for me, this is an absolute game changer. So I can adjust, I can put whatever I need on a particular spider base. If I'm using rails, bellows, pano bases, L brackets, it all works seamlessly together. So last year, I was testing the Z9. And when I go to the mountains, obviously lightness is a consideration that I have to take on board. When you're working sort of in those sort of areas, you're often having to work long distances. So carrying a really heavy tripod for me is not practical. But this is where I frequently use the Tripod M, and in this case, because that particular day in the mountains, the wind was quite severe and it was extremely cold. I put the legs from the Pro 7.5, the larger legs, on to give me that extra stability in the wind. I also use the Classic Ball 3 because it's that little bit lighter than the Classic Ball 5, and I attach a pano base, and the whole lot just works seamlessly together. So I have the ability to shoot straightforward imagery, which I did in this case. That's just a result from that particular spot. And I can also shoot, when I'm in the mountains, I can also shoot panos, which is one of my favorite types of photography as well. So I have the combination of being able to shoot just regular imagery or panoramic photography. The Tripod M is ideally balanced. It's not too light and it's not too heavy. And again, I can change the configuration depending on the day. Where I think the Tripod M really does work incredibly well is for all of the routine macro photography that I do. Here is a typical example of just what I would call macro photography, most of it below life size. That spider base with these typical legs, and the magic ball is my often preferred way of working when I'm having to walk about quite a lot and I'm away for quite a few hours at a time. So the flowers I'm actually photographing here are greater stitchwort. So I am taking a typical portrait shot, and then I carry the Castel XQ2 focusing rack with me always as well, because what I can do then, if I want to focus stack or get a much closer image, I have the facility to do that. Also, I developed, for some of you that may have my macro photography books, you will see that I developed what's called a stem stabilizer, and that I can attach to a delicate plant, and that will help stabilize it while I go through the sequence when I'm focus stacking. Ireland being an island, of course, there's no shortage of coastal locations. it does indeed have some truly amazing coastline. I always tend to use the Pro 7.5 in coastal locations quite simply because of its stability. I'm not usually having to carry it for miles on end. And another important factor is when you've got an incoming tide like this, the vibration of the waves as it hits the tripod legs, particularly if you're using neutral density filters and long exposures, can compromise your imagery. So this is why I frequently, even in my workshops, talk a lot about the importance of a tripod. But the way these images, these prelim images are shot just with my iPhone, the quality's not that good, but just so that you're aware. So this is typically how I would use the Pro 7.5, and that's just one of the results from that particular shoot on that evening. Tide comes in fast and well over these rocks. The Atlantic can be quite strong, particularly on days where the wind is quite severe. I think that's why it's such an important thing to have a tripod that, you know, is as stable as possible. This is probably without doubt one of the most photographed lighthouses in Ireland, Fanad Lighthouse. It sits on the Fanad Peninsula in northwest Donegal. There's been a light in some shape or form on that peninsula for well over 200 years. And it's been modified and rebuilt over that period of time. It's a mecca for photographers, I think quite simply because of its location and its overall pictorial quality. Many photographers like to go here when there's a storm, but I will point out it is an extremely dangerous place to be. There have been many serious injuries and fatalities at this lighthouse, particularly when you go to it when the weather conditions are severe. That's obviously when you'll get really impressive pictures. Problem is there's a cleft and you've a very, very narrow, rocky sort of outcrop to walk across. Problem is if you slip at all there, you will certainly fall down onto the rocks below. And that's exactly what I think happened. I think it was about 2014, 15 was the last person, photographer that I had heard of that had died. He'd been up there on a very, very stormy evening. So it's not without its dangers. And again, the winds are severe. Again, the incoming tide is coming in here, having the Pro 7.5 and it well supported in there. That's the way I like to work. That's just one of the results from that particular shoot on that day. I talked about if you had no head for heights. Well, if you're claustrophobic, you will not like this type of photography either. I've been commissioned twice to photograph cave systems in the Marble Arch region. And the first time I did it was in 1995. It's a very, very challenging place to work underground. When you look at this image here, we've actually come through this passage just with our lights. All of your equipment has to be sealed up and protected from water. Generators, cables have to be dragged in. You've got to position lights and set each shot up individually. And you're obviously working deep down, quite often wading through water. In this case, we have come a bit further on and we're on to a sort of a rocky outcrop where we're able to set everything up in order to get the shot. So it's a pretty challenging place to work. In this shot here, I've keyholed the lighting in this large chamber. The cavers have actually descended down from the woodland above, which is about 50 meters. And they wanted this type of imagery where they're abseiling down. Where the rope actually goes is very close to a huge drop. So it's a pretty dangerous place. We had to go a different way. They came down. We had to walk for about 3/4 of a kilometer and carry our equipment through to to do this type of photography. The guy in the picture here was one of the leaders, and we had a team of cave experts, and they were brilliant, and they carried generators and cables and helped set everything up. This type of photography is challenging, and at times you're going into areas that are very, very narrow. So I was a bit apprehensive initially, but I always like something different than a challenge, and this certainly was. The guy in the image was terrific caver, lots of experience, even though he was only 29 years old. And sadly, he died not long after I actually took this shot, which was a real tragedy. Then I heard from time to time about a secret waterfall and cave in Donegal. And this intrigued a lot of people, for nobody knew actually where it was. And then a couple of years ago, someone posted on the internet its location. And lots of people then were interested in traveling to see this. The problem with it is it's actually in an area where the tide can come out and in very, very quickly. You've got about a 2-hour window, and you've got to clamber over rocks and cliffs when the tide is out to get to the location. If you stay longer, what happens is the tide will come in and cut you off, and you'll be trapped. And the tide actually, this is the length of the cave, the tide actually comes well up. You can see the marcation line here along the top when the tide comes in on a very high tide. So you really have to make sure that if you get your imagery, you have to be out before and make your way back along those rocks before the tide starts to come in. Otherwise, you'll just get trapped. A little bit challenging to photograph because of the different exposure and light, within the cave itself and the waterfall. So this was a composite image that I made at the time. I'd like to go back to it again when there's more water, and perhaps in the future I will. The other thing that I have a great passion for is waterfalls, and I do travel everywhere, photographing them when I can, and I photographed a lot in Europe and in Iceland. Also, I've run a few workshops in Plitvice in Croatia, which has the national park, which is superb for waterfalls in the autumn time. So whenever I can, I like to do this. Again, having the extra extension on the Pro 7.5 and the long legs means when you're working at different elevations with rocks, it's much easier to position your tripod, and quite often the tripod is in the water itself. So at the end, you're dealing with the vibration and the water flow that's coming through. That's just one of the results from the waterfall just ahead that you saw there in that particular shoot. Last year, I was given a Z7 II to test for a while. And on the first evening, actually taking it out, I have it here in the Pro 7.5 of the Magic Ball. I went into a bluebell meadow just looking for subjects when I came across this green veined white that was resting on top of the bluebell. This is again shot with a 200 macro, again keeping the background nicely diffused. And this is my favorite way of working. I like to think I am a pictorial photographer, and I will look for subjects that create that sort of pictorial aspect and that ambience about an image. If it's not right and it doesn't fit my criteria, I tend not to photograph it unless I am specifically asked to do so. But the camera is a superb camera, and I used it for quite a while, and before I obviously had access to the Z9. but I think if there was no Z9, this certainly would be the next best choice for me. And this is a shot just showing you, this is my typical woodland setup when I don't have huge distances to walk. I use the Pro 7.5 Magic Ball. Here I've got the Z9 and I'm actually photographing these Scarlet Elf Cup fungi. You've got amazing stability here. This is also the new Z105. I did this some time ago, and it's my ideal kind of way of working. So taking a conventional shot, you've got, you know, very, very good stability, so you get the ultimate, I think, in sharpness. Then when I want to look at slightly different, you know, more oblique angles of subjects, then I can take out the focusing rail, the XQ2, and then I can focus stack. And the beauty about that is because everything is so stable, you have a lot less in terms of artifacts when you come to focus, you know, combine all of the images together. And really, when you look at, you know, moss and the detail that's in it, stability is, when you're focus stacking, is for me absolutely critical. So you do not want any movement at all in your equipment setup while you're going through the stacking process. That's the rail I currently use. It's superbly made. It's solid. I have a couple of rails from other companies. Quite frankly, this one does it for me. One of the unique aspects of the Pro 7.5 for me, which was a game changer, is the ability to very, very quickly invert the tripod legs so that you can get your camera right down at ground level. Now, companies advertise their tripod goes to ground level, and yes, it does. But when you add a head onto that, and then the camera itself, your sensor is not, you're not able to get your sensor parallel at ground level with the subject. Within a minute, you can quickly invert the legs on the Pro 7.5, and you've now got your camera right down at ground level. When I'm shooting plants and orchids, I frequently utilize the camera in this position. That is one of the things I really do like about the Pro 7.5. And here is the result from that image that I shot with my iPhone. And the beauty again is when you need to control background clutter, being able to get your camera right down means you can increase the distance between the subject and your background, and you can get perhaps a better diffusion. And that's exactly how I like to use the tripod in that situation quite frequently. One of the things that I didn't pay that much attention initially when I got the tripod was mini legs, or I think Martin calls them drumsticks. But actually, these are an amazing accessory to have. And as photographers, we all come across situations, particularly when we're using ultra wide angle lenses, where we just can't get the tripod legs in the position we want, and we end up, you know, sometimes having bits of the foreground in our composition that we don't want. This is one of the great situations where 2 seconds removes a leg or 2 legs, you screw in the mini legs. Now you can get your camera right on top of the bridge, as in this case, and nothing is in the way. A situation like this is another spot that I find the mini legs indispensable. Sometimes you cannot just frame the subject the way you would like because one of the legs just gets in the way where the tree trunk is. Again, this shows a classic example of where removing the leg and replacing it with a mini leg. There's a moth sitting on the tree trunk here. Allows me to get the camera into a better position, and that is the outcome. So using the mini legs for me is a very, very useful accessory. If I'm doing a lot of ground photography, it has a lot less impact on the surrounding vegetation if you're using the 3 mini legs. And in this case here, obviously, you can see on the back of the LCD screen the subject, and I've outlined it in the background there where I'm actually photographing. That, in combination with the Classic Ball 5, is an extremely stable setup, and more than capable of holding the D850 here on the 200 millimeter macro. That's the finished result. So here is another classic situation. I do a lot of lichen photography, and often the tripod legs just become a bit of a nuisance. I'm trying to manipulate the camera into the ideal position. Here is a hybrid setup that works incredibly well. 2 mini legs replace the main legs, and I can still keep the other leg in the back. That prevents me from actually having to try and place the legs up in the air on each side of the rock. So I find them just extremely useful in so many situations. Here's a situation again where I'm working on a rock face, and it is just much easier to use the mini legs and without having to use the others. And it's easy to move around. And I often work this way. Just a typical result from doing that type of photography. This is a coastal lichen called Caloplaca flavescens. Well, the CASTEL-MICRO. What a change this one component made in my higher magnification macro photography. Sure, there are other or there are other manufacturers that make electronic rails. I know that, but in my opinion, having tested a stack shot against the use of the Novaflex CASTEL-MICRO, which I borrowed initially to do a review on, for me there just was no compromise. The electronic rail is such an advantage to have in your macro photography, even in low magnification photography. And I want to outline some of the reasons as to why. You can see in a typical setup of mine there, I've got the rail, I've got the focusing rail, and I've got, I think it's Ed 7 there, and I reversed 24 to 70. And one of the beauties currently at the moment, if you happen to own a Z series camera, Novaflex, as they do for other camera manufacturers, make a reverse adapter which has complete automation and communication with the camera, something which is not currently available if you're using an F-mount Nikon system. So this was a big advantage to me as well. But the advantages of using an electronic rail are actually quite important. First of all, it's speed. If you have to do a focus stack of 60 shots, that means 60 times you have to touch your setup, and it's slow. An electronic rail will do it considerably faster, and you only need to touch it once, and it will carry out the process. You have also precise control over the stepping distance, whereas you don't have that if you're trying to do it manually with the focusing rail by hand. It's got automatic advancement of the camera assembly. Some cameras like the D850 and Canons have an inbuilt focus stacking system there, but it's used in the automatic focus of the lens, which can be a bit unpredictable. And I've always found that to be the case, especially when you go on to use it at much higher magnifications, which is why I don't, as a rule, use it. This is a much more accurate, consistent approach to it. you've got, obviously, when you use an electronic rail, you've got reduced artifacts at higher magnifications. This is what I've found. And you have that continuity each time in the results, something that you don't always have with in-camera stacking. If you actually look at the picture below, you'll see it's a picture of a very, very tiny flower called a herb Robert. And these are the stamens that I've homed in on. And using an electronic rail, I mean, they're only no more than 3 millimeters across. So it gives you the idea of the control and what you can actually achieve if you switch a lot of your photography to using an electronic rail. These are just some examples that I've shot using the CASTEL-MICRO. Once I had it, there's a review on my website, as there is with some of the other NovaFlex products that I currently own and use. It was a game changer for me. I just had to have it. One of the other things the rail actually does have as well, which other rails do not have. First of all, the NovaFlex rail has the quality of build, and that's very important when you're using it outside continually in all sorts of conditions. The NovaFlex rail also has a continuous dovetail. So even if you not want to use the CASTEL-XQ2 rail initially, you can still position, because of the long dovetail on the rail, you can position the focus point almost to where you want it to begin with. That's something that the other rails don't have. You tend to have just a very short dovetail, so you don't have that ability to be able to position the rail more or less exactly where you want it to begin with. But I found in my experience of using the rail that the quality of the stacked images and the composite outcome were really amazing, and I had so little in terms of artifacts to actually deal with. It's when you go into sort of experiment at much higher magnifications. Now we've got an early purple orchid here. I wanted, if you look at the lower flower, I wanted to go in close here and just have an image of the pollinia, which are incredibly small. And this is where conventional stacking using a manual approach is just too difficult and unpredictable. But using the rail and taking 70 or 80 photographs, which it can do in very, very quick succession, you can actually wander off and look for something else while it's doing it. These are the sort of results. And that is one of the reasons why I have switched a lot of my general focus stacking just to use an electronic rail quite a lot of the time. There are a lot of images on the internet where photographers use set specimens or specimens that have died for high magnification macro. I personally don't do that as a rule. Insects are incredibly difficult to photograph because they're live, and not many will tolerate a rail being pushed in front of them only a few millimeters away. And quite often they move and twitch, and it can be a frustrating procedure. But every now and again, you will get subjects, particularly like moths, which when they're settled and they're not stressed, can sit for periods of time. That's again where the electronic rail scores, because you can get these types of images relatively quickly when the moth is settled for a period of time. This is a species called Manduca sexta, and this is exactly what I've done here. I think I shot this with the Laowa 5x macro. And when it's possible, I have shot a number of different live subjects using the electronic rail. I shoot lots of static subjects with it, but I won't kill an insect or anything just as a conservationist as well. I don't do it. But the detail that you can get electronically with so little in terms of having to correct for artifacts, to me is one of the fundamental reasons why you should consider an electronic rail. This is the one exception. Our dog has a habit of nailing every single wasp that comes into the sunroom, and unfortunately, this one met its end. So I actually took advantage of this specimen and did a focus stack on it. It's about over 3 times life size, and again, at magnifications, from really 2 upwards, you really do see the benefits of using an electronic rail, in my opinion. This is one of the most beautiful moths in Europe. It's called the Spanish moon moth. It's named after, I think, Queen Isabella of Spain. And certainly in terms of Saturnas, which I mentioned earlier, I don't think there's a prettier one in Europe than this one. It's only found now in a few locations in the French Pyrenees and in Spain, and I think there's a little population in Switzerland. But the interesting thing about it is when the moth is perfectly at ease, you have the possibility of getting in really, really close, providing you don't touch it, and looking at a higher magnification on the eye spots. And again, these are all shot with the electronic rail, and you've got amazing detail. You're 3 times life size here. And for those photographers out there who don't own a macro lens, whether you're a Canon or a Sony shooter or a Nikon shooter, you don't need necessarily to own a macro lens to achieve these type of images. You can see here, although I've got the BAL bellows on, but I'm actually using the standard 24-70 kit lens that comes with an Nikon Z7 II. It's reversed on the Novaflex reverse adapter, and the Z lenses are such amazing quality. I've been truly astounded by them since I've tested some of them. I've been so impressed. You can achieve magnifications depending on where you set the focal length, easily up to 3 times life size, and the results are incredibly sharp. This is just an example of the stamens of this Physaris that that you can achieve. The detail is quite amazing, and that's just from a straightforward 24-70 zoom reversed. So you can do lots of photography just by utilizing that one lens with an electronic rail, or if you don't want to use an electronic rail, just the reverse adapter and being able to reverse it onto your camera, you'll get some pretty impressive results. And I think more than anyway, the reverse adapters are available for all of the major camera systems. I think that's correct, isn't it?
It is. They are available for all the mirrorless camera systems. We have Nikon Z, we have Canon EOS R, we have Micro Four Thirds, we have Fuji X mount, we have L mount, which is Leica, Panasonic, and Sigma, and then we have a DSLR system, which is Canon EOS, and unfortunately not yet for Nikon F mount, as you pointed out earlier.
Yes, since a lot of people are deciding to go mirrorless, it's a great opportunity, and it's a less expensive way of exploring the smaller world without having to initially spend a lot more money perhaps on a rail. You can then decide what you want to do afterwards. In combination with the bellows, which I've illustrated, gives you absolutely superb possibilities and lots of room for experimenting with different subjects. With obviously haven't used the Z9 for quite some time now. I also use the BAL F bellows, but I also use the BAL Pro 1 bellows as well, particularly when I'm using a heavier system. And in here in this example, I'm using the latest 105Z macro lens. It's connected to.
Sorry to interrupt you, Robert. One of our viewers pointed out that I forgot to mention Sony E-mount. So sorry for all the Sony E-mount shooters.
Right. Yeah. Well, okay. Fair enough. So sometimes it's difficult to remember everything, but this is another setup that I like to use. There's excellent working distance with the Nikon 105, and the BAL Pro 1 bellows is ideally suited to a much heavier setup or to medium format cameras. I think that's where it's ideally placed for those sorts of cameras. But you can use any camera on it at all. As I say, I use both, but I prefer when I'm using heavier setups to use the BAL Pro 1. But just to give you some idea of the level of quality beyond life size with the 105, here's the small stamens of a mallow captured, and the lens works superbly at magnifications beyond 1:1. So I'm very, very happy with this setup as well. I've tested many different lenses. The beauty about it as well is that you've got total compatibility between the camera and the lens, the bellows, everything with that reverse adapter works seamlessly and perfectly. I've had no issues at all whatsoever. And then just scrolling through the last number of images, all shot at much higher magnifications, utilizing the CASTEL-MICRO in the field. It's quick. It's once you get used to it, you can set it up very, very quickly in the field. I tend to keep if it's bellows or whether it's the rail and the focusing rack, I tend to keep it all just together in my bag, and then when I approach a subject, I can just put it all on in one click onto the head, and it doesn't take that long to line it up. And I'm using it on battery power. The control unit has a facility for two batteries, and I find that more than covers a whole day's photography. And of course, you've got that diversity of subjects. Slime molds in recent times have become very, very popular. But again, here's where the rail really excels. You're talking about subjects here that are only 2 millimeters, 3 millimeters high. And these subjects are best dealt, I think, electronically with a rail, and they can be done quite quickly. I also use it, as I've said earlier, conventionally as well for some of the lower magnification work. And the reason I do that is in situations where there is a lot of intricate detail, I find that the rail works quickly, but there are less problems with artifacts. And when you look at the final image here, the composite image, and you look at all of the details in the mosses, you quite often sometimes, if you're trying to do it manually by hand through focus advancement, rotation on the lens, you will quite often see blurred spots and artifacts within the detail. You will not find that, or I have not experienced that in the same way since I started to use the electronic rail even for a lot of other straightforward subjects. The other thing is, I think when you're this Phaeographus orchid here, where you're trying to hold focus from, a near point to quite, a reasonable distance away, that is often where the software really does show artifacts. And I've experienced that many times in the past, and it's quite time consuming to try and eliminate that. Using the rail and maybe using 100 to 120 individual images, it precisely controls everything, and you get much cleaner, better results. With the CASTEL-MICRO, you have a choice of setting the stepping measurements, or you can set the number of photographs and it will automatically calculate the stepping distance. If you want more information, please go to the reviews on my website and you'll find a lot more information in detail than I can obviously discuss in the webinar. The other nice thing about focus stacking as well is when you accumulate the images, you can decide where to end the depth of field. So in this passion flower, this passiflora, I just kept the stamens in focus and stopped it there. But having the ability to keep the whole of the flower in focus isn't a problem. So you can be quite creative for where you want to isolate a particular component from the rest of the subject. And finally, another situation that I find the rail really works incredibly well is when you're photographing frost. This happened to be, during the winter, one of the cyclamens, we had a heavy frost. And I mean, just the detail alone that the rail will allow you to pick out is, I think, for me, what makes it an important part now in my overall kit. So don't be afraid to not only experiment with larger magnifications, but if you happen to own an electronic rail, try using it even at lower magnifications, because I think your results will always be that little bit better, quite simply because it's controlled. And I think that's one of the most important aspects. You'll have a lot less post-production time involved in producing the composite. So thank you all for tuning in. I'm grateful that you have. I hope that some of the information that I've passed on is of use. I know there is a question and answer session, and I'm happy to answer some of the questions as best I can, and I'm sure Martin will fill in any other details that I might miss.
Well, Robert, first of all, let me say a huge thank you. Thanks for your time and your knowledge, and most importantly, thanks for your friendship, because we have a very close friendship for 2 years now.
We have, yes. Even in our tastes, as you pointed out, now everybody knows I watch Korean dramas. So, yes. But I would also want to say a big thank you to NovaFlex for not only having the faith and allowing me at times to take some of their equipment and utilize it, write about it. That is something that I'm extremely grateful for. And at least I get the opportunity to try some of the equipment, as they say, before you buy.
Well, there's a few questions. So if you'd like, you can have a glass of water first, and then we can go through them.
Okay, far away.
Okay. Well, then let's start with Colin. He's asking, how do you retain the color palette in both the subject and purge background so well?
I don't do anything particularly special. To be perfectly honest, I've always found Nikon RAW files to be amongst the best, and I think many other photographers do agree with that. I don't do anything special in Lightroom. I process just in a straightforward way, like everybody else does. I tend to shoot the color profile on my Nikons is neutral. I don't use Vivid. All of what I shoot is shot on neutral. That's what I use. The other thing I should point out as well is I use a fixed color temperature. I never set any of my Nikons on automatic, particularly even when you're focus stacking. That's important because if you're working outdoors and your light is changing, your color temperature is going to change as you stack, and that can cause a problem. Therefore, working with a fixed color temperature and presets means that if I'm in a woodland, I have a preset that I've already tested. And if I need to make a global change, everything will be exactly the same. So I don't do anything particularly special to it at all. What you see is what there is, basically.
Thank you. There's another question from Dr. Harut from Armenia. He writes, I noticed you're using the bellows in a way when the lens stays at the same place while the body moves back and forth. Is there any specific reason? And I answered, it's mostly about reflection. It does not change on the subject.
Yeah.
Anything you would want to add?
No, that's more or less it. Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly.
So does the CASTEL-MICRO fit standard Arca Swiss plates? That it's fully Arca compatible. We can say that. There was another question that you answered throughout your presentation. Do you use Nikon in-camera built-in stacking? No, you're working with CASTEL-MICRO.
Yes. Initially at the beginning I did. But the one thing that I find I much prefer with NovaFlex software, you can allocate a start and an end position. With the inbuilt focus shifting in Nikon, you can't. You just have to guess. So I much prefer to have a start and an end point, and the system works within those confines. I also can find, autofocus can be a wee bit hit or miss. So I think if you're seriously interested to high magnification macro, I think you're much better working manually and not using autofocus. I'm not sure what your opinion is on that, but that's mine.
Thank you. And there's a final question coming in from Andrew. When you shoot reptile images, how do you deal with reflections from glass?
Well, first of all,
I think he's referring to the tank that you built.
Oh, yes, right. Well, yeah. If there are any reflections, what I have is I have a large black card, okay, and it's attached to a filter. So if I think there's going to be a problem with reflections, I screw that on, and that totally neutralizes it. But to be perfectly honest, in the vast majority of situations, when you hit the subject with flash, it overcomes that problem.
Thank you. And another 2 questions are coming in as we speak. Michael is asking, with the reversed lens, is it open to dust and moisture? And also shooting non-reverse, do you use polarizing filters?
No, I use polarizing filters quite often, sometimes in plant photography or in situations where I feel it'll benefit. When I reverse lenses, not really. Dust, I'm working out in the field. They're tools for a job. I'm reasonably careful, but I don't really encounter that much of a problem. If I feel that there is a problem, I just simply wipe it or use a blower brush. Sometimes I have little homemade hoods that I can position on to help, but as a rule, it's not something that I can say I've had a huge issue with, to be perfectly honest.
And the first part of the question, is the lens open to dust and moisture when reversed? I can say that the reverse adapters come with a little glass filter to protect it and to prevent dust and moisture to enter the entire setup. Okay, and final question from Louise. What is the maximum magnification with the Novaflex bellows and the 105 macro lens when fully extended?
You will certainly, I've never looked at it in detail, but you will certainly get, I would say, with the Val Pro 1, you'll certainly get up to 4 times life size.
It's 3.5 times magnification, if you look up the numbers correct. So
certainly up close to it.
Yeah,
but then if you have to place an extension tube or anything between that and the camera to get,
you'll definitely reach 4 times magnification.
Which sometimes you'll have to do depending on which way you're using your bellows.
So I think going through the questions. There's another one coming in. Larry is asking, what stacking software gives you good results?
I've only ever, well, I've experimented in the early days with different Zern stacker, and but I've used for years Helicon Focus. That's
Helicon,
what
Helicon Focus.
Yes.
That's your suggestion. Okay, I'll let us switch from the presentation. I think that is it. People are writing super presentation. Thank you very much. Stunning photos, great presentation, excellent and inspirational. So, well, Robert, thank you very much again. I mean, you were showing us the gear that you use, and most importantly, how to use it. And you seasoned all of this with your amazing images. So once again, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks very much for the invitation to speak. Bye.
Good night.